Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos that I'm doing about RPG mechanics, particularly how they relate to characters and character development in video games, particularly, of course, RPG video games, which is part of a larger suite of videos that I'm doing about game design in general, on lots of different aspects of it. And in this one, I want to talk about balancing for the three core RPG character mechanics. Well, I'm going to talk about two of them in this, which are the skill system, the XP and leveling system, and the player stats that kind of drive everything. So the first thing I want to say is that actually there's a whole load of relevant stuff that I did in an earlier video, which is in the races and classes set, where I talk about balancing. I give a lot more generalized thoughts about balancing, the needs for balancing, where uh, balancing needs particularly to be done. And in this video, I'm going to look at uh, more specific ways of actually achieving balance in these three mechanics. So there's a lot to be balanced here because these systems represent potentially quite a lot of player choice, and how much you want to balance depends on how balanced you need things to be, which might depend on whether you've got PvP, whether you've got parties or not, or whether it's just a single player game. And so your needs vary between the different play modes potentially. So the more choice the player has, the more things need, the more work is needed if you're going to do balancing, because you've got potential different builds that your player might have as they play through. And while you as a designer may look at the potential for the builds, uh, then don't discount the idea that a player might find a way of doing a build that you hadn't thought of. And I guess what you want to avoid is for them to be able to find a killer strategy that will just dominate everything in games. So there's no substitute for playtesting, as always. And the best way of working out where your balance is at and where your balance needs tweaking is to have data uh, on how things go when you playtest. Um, I talked briefly about the skill system. Obviously, there's a need to do balancing there, and to think about the numbers that you use when you give increases in things and skills. There's a whole load of obviously tweaking that you can do in there. I don't think that I really need to talk about that in particular, and some of it will be similar to the skills balancing. What I want to talk about is the XP level curve, and I'll talk a bit about the stats as well in a few minutes. So in terms of the XP level curve, this is actually a prime place to do some balancing and tuning. And the reason for this is because uh, unlike some of the other places where you might do balancing, it's the end product in some ways, in that um, or maybe it's the front product. Depends on how you think about it in terms of your systems. Um, but XP rewards are potentially arbitrary numbers. But the other thing that's hugely arbitrary is this question of when do you level up, and you want to get this balancing, but just changing that number of the amount of XP needed to get to the next level is an easy thing to change that can affect the overall balance of everything that is connected with leveling up. So it's a prime way of doing balancing. I want to give an example of something that I've observed that's been done. This is from Dungeons and Dragons, the dice rolling game. And this is so this is XP per level. This is not accumulative. So this has been done so it's the gap from one level to the next, and this is in kind of tens and thousands. So one thing that's immediately obvious to me that is somewhat different to most video games is that this curve does not rise as sharply. And I think there are really good reasons for this in pen and paper game playing, which is that you tend to get more commitment earlier. And one of the reasons that you do the diminished returns thing in rewards in games is it's about balancing rewarding enough to keep players playing and to keep them committed, but not to keep them overwhelmed. And it's in my head, this kind of feels a little bit like this idea that you may have heard of that children for them a year is almost forever, and it seems to go on for a very long time. And as you get older, the years just seem to get shorter and shorter. And I think there's a similar thing with if you put leveling equally distant in your game, then as you play through, it will start to feel like it's almost that it's getting closer and closer together. And it's not, but there's such an expectation that these are spread out, particularly in video games, in a kind of logarithmic way that it would feel weird if it wasn't like that. There are, I think, particular points where players stop playing. One of them is just after this installed. Another is just after you've done the tutorial, and another is after they've done the first play session. I don't know where you could say the other kind of significant points are, but as as a player plays through, they get more committed to a game, and then eventually something kind of snaps, and they either get distracted and wander off and play something else, or they something changes and they get sick of it and give up, or they get to the end, um, and that's uh, a good way for players to finish. Um, anyway, that was just me talking about why this curve isn't so sharp. But the interesting thing here to notice is that there's a dip in it between 11 and 12. The actual XP per level increase from 10 to 11 is different, and it jumps down to for the gap between 11 and 12. And this is a curious thing. And I came across this. Somebody was asking about this on a forum, and there was actually a person who was one of the designers uh, for this system actually got involved in the discussion and discuss why this was the case. Let me kind of expand a bit more on what is going on here with another graph, which came from the same place, which is the graph of encounters per level. So when I talked about spreading your levels for and designing your XP per level curve, I talked about how you might start from thinking about how many encounters you want between levels, and this is the same thing for D&D, but it's got four graphs here, uh, four curves there because they're easy, medium, hard, and deadly, so they're rated the different encounters. Um, and again, there's this spike, so it settles into this point where you're doing about 30 encounters between 5 and 6, 6 and 7, 7 and 8. There's a little bit of a jump up between 10 and 11, and then it drops. And this is quite a dramatic drop from 30 down to 20, uh, roughly speaking, on the blue curve. So it's different on the medium curve. It's from 15 down to 10, but it's a similar kind of drop. And as I said, somebody who was involved in the design of this got involved and commented on this, and they said what they said is that actual campaign settings have a tendency to run in between 1 and 10, or a little bit further, and that they'd been seeing a drop in numbers of players above that where people had stopped playing. And so this was a deliberate attempt to keep people playing by upping the reward rates. and bringing those rewards and that kind of dopamine thing that comes with rewards back into play as if it was kind of earlier in the game. And you can see how that um, is a thing that's been attempted. It might not work. I don't know. I kind of hope for their sake that it did work. But this was something that they did, not just tuning, but actually thinking about specific problems that they wanted to solve in terms of retention, and doing that through the XP level curve. Um, so your curve can vary as you need it. Not all curves are smooth curves. This one's got a bit of a jump in it. And the other thing is that you don't have to have the same curve for all your classes. So if you have a disparity between your classes, um, well, I guess it doesn't solve the nature of whether people are balanced at the same level, but it does solve about balancing over time and to how much they're playing. Okay. So XP level curve is different, and also you can use this to kind of uh, compensate for the fact that potentially uh, players get more experience as they play along. Also, that some of them might be leveling faster if they've got certain classes that level faster. So in the early versions of Dungeons and Dragons, I remember them being different curves for different classes. I don't believe there are now, but there's no reason in a video game why you can't do this, because it's usually under the hood and not seen in terms of absolute numbers. You usually give a bar, and the player looks at the bar and kind of sees how far they've got to go. So that's talk about the XP level curve. The other thing I want to talk about is stats, and a particular issue uh, with the balance and tuning of stats, uh, because it's very common to have some kind of mechanic like this, which is you can spend plus 1 point on any stat for every time you level up. Okay, and this then drives the fact that there may be, or if you've got stats that are more powerful, one stat that's more powerful than another, um, that might cause you problems. You also might have problems if the way the stat works, as you expand that 1 point, the increment in power actually increases as you go along or decreases as you go along. So uh, if that's not kind of a flat thing, then if it increases as you go along, that encourages specialization. If it decreases as you go along, it encourages generalization. And if it's flat, then it will encourage people to make their own choices. Um, so you need them to be balanced in the effect that they have as much as you can in terms of using that stat number, especially um, if you're saying it's that they're often starting numbers around 10, and then you plus 1 per level as you go along, and then so what is that number used for? So here's an example that I'm going to quickly look at in which I'm doing some tweaks to a formula. And so this is just one of the formula that may be at play. So we've got here a very simple kind of damage calculation that's going on inside of combat, which is that the amount of damage that you do is your strength times your weapon damage. This is probably a melee combat formula. And this is quite a straightforward and easy thing to see and to understand. And as your strength increases with the weapon that you've got, without changing weapon, you're starting to do more and more damage as you go through. Similarly, if you get a better weapon for the same strength, that will also increase the damage that you do. So one end of balancing this would be to balance or to think about the not to think about the damage side, and what does that damage represent in terms of how many times you have to hit an enemy before they die, and changing the health levels of enemies. That's one way of dealing with this. But that potentially works across several different types of damage, and so maybe unbalance things elsewhere. So you maybe want to be focusing on this, the right hand side of this, which is the strength times weapon damage. Okay. So one way of approaching this is to actually make more complexity in this formula. And this particular complexity that I've added here is I've got strength times weapon damage times 0.88. So what I'm doing is I'm bringing that increase by each strength point down a little bit. But I've also added an offset, which is this plus 13. Now, plus 13 might not be very much. It might be a bigger number than that. But, plus 13 might be exactly what you want. And the times 0.88 is, a bit of a tweak. It's not a huge tweak, but it's a moderate tweak there. Both this and the previous formula are straight line formulas. Effectively, if you're changing the strength, it changes the damage by a linear amount. But the gradient of this curve is less. So over time, it increases less. But it has this bump. So that bump has more of an effect at the lower values of strength than it will at higher values. So what I've done is I've taken a particular straight line graph and I've changed the line so that it's less steep, but it's been bumped up. And this is a classic way of approaching straight line graphs, which is called y equals mx plus c. The stuff that I'm talking about here is basically the maths of functions and of graphs. And you may be looking at games design because you're not interested in maths or you don't feel very strong or capable at maths. And I'm sorry that I'm throwing maths back at you, but this is actually the reality of games design, is that some understanding of maths is really helpful. And if you don't know about this stuff or want to bone up on it, these are the kind of keywords that you want to be looking for: functions and graphs. And linear equations, as I said, the general form of it is y equals mx plus c. There's quadratic equations, which use a square. So they're usually expressed as ax squared plus bx plus c. And that's, again, you've got three things in there, the a, b, and the c, that can change the shape of that graph, the steepness, lift it up and down, and so on. Computers are really good using maths, so these formulae actually can be as complicated as you can handle. Here's another way of approaching the same thing, which is an even better way. So here I've got the same formula, but I've taken out those numbers, the 0.88 and the 13, if I remember rightly, and I've said damage equals strength times weapon damage times parameter 1 plus parameter 2. And what I'm doing here is making it so that maybe these parameters could be read in from a text file. And so you don't have to rebuild your game to change this balance in order to test it. And if you start throwing things like this towards your programmers, then, or if you're the programmer yourself, that might be happening. But if you're, within a team throwing this at your programmers, they might be mildly impressed that you're aware that you can do this sort of thing in programming. So this would aid towards tweaking that straight line. Of course, if you don't want a straight line, then you need to make changes to that. If you want a curve which is not a standard curve that can be expressed through a mathematical formula, there is an alternative, which is to use what's called lookup tables, which is where you just have a table and you have a value that you input, and you basically store all the different possible values for the outputs that you could have. So strength 1 gives you this number, strength 2 gives you this number, etc. And that can change the way that these things respond in any kind of variety of ways. So, as I said before, computers are good at maths. This is the sort of formula that would be avoided if you were doing a pen and paper dice rolling RPG, because you don't want things to be too complicated. I know some people really like their complicated rules for these systems, but if you throw too much at it, it can get very complex. I happen to know that the combat damage calculations for World of Warcraft are horrifically complicated. But that's fine, because it's a computer that's doing it, and computers are good at maths, and you can let that get as complicated as you like, because actually a damage calculation isn't one that's going to slow your game down it's your graphics where your bottleneck is. Um, so yeah, computers can be as good at maths as you are. So that's a couple of instances or places where you can do some tweaking using these mechanics. And I will say what I usually say at this point, which is that's it from me for now.